In this video, what I'm going to cover is how do you update a record in your ASP.NET MVC app using the Entity Framework. So at this point, we've gone through and we've done inserts where we've created new DTO objects, and we've done context.add and then added that object. Hit called save changes, and it saved the new DTO or new object, new record into the database, and we got a new row. Deletes, we've done much the same, where we pull out an object and then we delete it from the context, and then we end up with no record at all in the database. In and out, no big deal. This one is it's really not any more difficult. The approach that I typically take, actually, I feel is the most clear. You'll find online there's other ways to do it, and I'll touch on those a little bit. Also with this video, just to make it shorter, what I've done is I've actually pre-coded everything, so it's really going to be more of a code review. I'm going to walk you through what I've done and explain to you the code that I've written and why it works the way it does. Alright, so this should hopefully look fairly familiar to you. This screen is our user manager screen. It's where we talked about how do you list a series of records, how do you add checkboxes, how do you do things like delete or selected deletes. This is that screen. One change that I've made to it is I went ahead and actually added an edit button. Now the edit button, the code's actually pretty straightforward. It's similar to our delete button. I've got it here in the application if you're curious, and once I post the code of the project up, you'll be able to see that as well. But basically it's just an A tag with a URL action to edit, and then just like our delete button, I'm passing the user ID in, and then I've got some bootstrapper stuff going on there to make it look good. So no big deal there. So the idea is once I click on the edit button, I want to actually go into an edit screen so that I can edit my user. So I've got username, first name, last name, email address. I'm going to change it to my UC username, first name, last name, email address, and hit save. And we'll see here that I get user saved. My username is now reflected, first name, last name, and email address. So how does that process work of pulling the record, showing it on the screen to be edited, and then saving those changes back? How do we do that update process to the database? So the first thing you have is you need an edit action. And we have an edit get and then an edit post when we save. And the edit get has to actually go out and fetch the user record and then load up the page, get it all set up, and then once the user fills in the form and they hit save, then we have to take that data, post it back to our action, and we'll have an HTTP post action. That action then pulls the data out of the view model and then puts it back into a DTO and then saves that DTO back to the database. So we'll start with this screen of setting up the get side of the edit. So I'll jump in here. I'm going to switch over to my user manager controller, and you'll see here that I have two edit routines or actions. I've got my top one here, which is my get. It takes an ID, and then I've got my bottom one here, which is my HTTP post, and it takes a user manager view model, which is the same view model that we created in a previous lecture. So let's focus on the get for now. So the get has a series of steps, and those steps involve setting up a user view model that we're going to send to our view to set up our page. And then we basically go through and we get the current user from the database using this ID. Now the ID is the user that we want to edit, their ID or primary key from the database. So we get that ID, and we're getting that because this edit button on our list, on our index page, it actually is passing the user ID as it renders out each one of those rows. So this ID here from the user object is the ID here that we're getting into our edit action when we do the get. So user ID, we create a DB context for our project. We then grab a user DTO and we I'm using the find routine off of the context. So this is context, users, that's my DB set, and then there's a find method. I'm using the async version of that. And then I pass in that ID, the primary key value, into find, and find will then grab a matching user from the database if it exists. Again, this is async, so we need an await, and that's that idea of doing things asynchronously, saving resources, parking processes when we're waiting for the database and waiting for the data to come back. It's those kinds of ideas. So we get our user object, just doing a quick check to make sure we actually got a user, and then what I'm doing here in the next step is I'm taking that user manager view model, I'm creating a new one, storing it in user VM, and then I'm just copying the values from the user DTO into the view model. So email, first name, ID, last name, username, all those properties are properties of my view model, and I'm copying the value out of the DTO into the view model. So I'm setting up my view model to be a copy of my DTO. So once I've got that in place, close up my context, don't need it anymore, and then I say return view, which is my edit view, and then I'm passing that view model that I want drawn out in the edit screen. Now to set up this view, I use the template as my starting point. So I actually right-clicked here inside of the edit action. I clicked add view. It pulls the name. I dropped down here and I chose edit. And then under model class, I did user manager view model. I left these two boxes unchecked, checked it for the default layout, and I hit add. And the scaffolder went through and it built me a page that looks like this. Now this I did nothing to except it drew out an is selected checkbox here at the bottom, which I've already deleted. So if we flip back over to that view, there was a checkbox down here under email address that said is selected. That makes sense on the index page when I could be selecting a user. On this page, it makes no sense to have that, so I remove that checkbox. It's irrelevant in the context of this workflow or this process, but if it was something that we were doing where we were selecting multiple users, then obviously we need that property of is selected to know whether that particular user was selected. So just quickly highlighting here, we have editor for and each one of our model properties. So username, first name, last name, email address, and then we have our submit button here on the bottom. This is all wrapped up inside of an HTML begin form. And that's again just to be able to capture that data and present it and then submit it back. Now the editor for, since we're taking our model username, this model represents this user VM. So that user VM is getting sent to the view, and when it gets picked up by the view and processed, this username is actually taking the username text or string out of our view model and it's putting it in the text box for us. It's pre-populating the text box with our user data. So with that user data in there, we're now in place and now set up to at least present to the user all of the existing information about the user that's being edited. So we've got this form, we fill it out, and we hit submit. So then the submit piece of it takes us into the postback, or the HTTP post handler of the edit process. So we start off with the new copy of the user VM that gets created by the model binder. That new user VM, we basically kind of do things backwards. So we start by creating a DB context for our project. We use the same find async, and in doing that, this ID value is now actually coming from, there's a hidden field in this is our edit view. In here is a hidden for model ID, so the primary key for that user gets stored right here in this hidden field. So then it gets picked up and bound back into our view model. So this ID is the same ID number, the same primary key from the database. So context, we grab the user DTO from the database using that ID. Now if we were to put a breakpoint right here, what we would notice inspecting the properties is that the DTO has all the old values and the view model has all the new values. So what we have to do is we have to then copy each property from the view model into the DTO. And I've made some notes here in the comments that basically what happens is that the DTO acts as a proxy between your code and the database. And that little proxy class will keep track of changes that are made to your object. So every time you update a property, it notices that and it tracks that as a change. And since you just pulled that DTO from the database, you're ensured that you've got the latest version of that object, so that when you do your update, you're updating the most current version. So we simply just copy the values over, and then we call save changes. And again, I'm using the async version of that with the await. You can just call save changes without the async. You don't have to worry about the await or the async up here. But it's just a good practice to start getting familiar with calling async methods. So we set all that up. This essentially updates the record in the database for us. These, about 10 lines of code, probably a little less. And then the last step here is just setting up a status message with state and then redirecting back to the index page, which lists all the users. Now, as I was writing this, I started out using a viewbag. So I had viewbag.statusMessage, viewbag.statusState. And I realized quickly that the viewbag does not work with the redirect to action. The viewbag is only valid within the context of a particular request. And what happens when you call redirect to action is that you're actually redirecting out to an entirely new page request, and that viewbag doesn't make it round trip. So instead, using temp data, it has a longer persistence life than the viewbag. So calling temp data, you treat it like a dictionary. So temp data, square bracket, and string, which is your key, and then the value is what you want to save. So inside of status message, I put user saved, and status state is success. And then I redirect back to index. Now, to handle this on the other side, I don't do it inside of my index action. I could, but I find it's easier just to go straight to the view and then just add this little block of logic. It's an if statement with a little bit of work. And basically I'm saying if my temp data for status message has a string, so I use the string.isNull or white space to check for this to be a string. Then I'm doing some casting here. And if this is a string, if there is a value in here, and so not is null or white space. So if it's not null or white space, i.e. a value, and this contains a string value, then I'd fall into this if statement and I say alert dash, and then I pull that status state. And what I set it to here is success. So that success string gets appended to alert. So it becomes alert dash status. And I do to lower, which in lowercase is everything because that's what Bootstrap wants. And then I say output a div tag with alert and alert dash status, or I'm sorry, alert dash success is what this becomes. And then this is the actual message of user saved. So I end up with a div. The alert dash success style sheet attribute gives us a green text box, which kind of just shows success. And then the temp data status message is just that string of text saying user saved. So that just renders out if there's a message to be rendered. So let's look back at that one more time. So I'm on this edit page. I hit my save. It posts back these values, and let's make some changes. We'll make this Kevin.Gantos and Kevin Bob and gantoka@gmail.com. So let's just kind of update all of these fields to give us a reflect that we've made changes. So we hit save. So here's my box, my alert of user saved. If we right click here real fast and look into our developer tools, we'll see here alert and alert dash success. So that's our style sheet, our Bootstrap CSS that's giving us that green box. So just giving that user some response or feedback telling them that things worked. And then we can see here that my username is updated, my first name, and my email address have all updated to reflect the change. So that process of going through and doing those updates of, I'm sorry, not there, but under your HTTP post, looking at grab your context, grab your user from the database, copy values from your view model into your DTO, and then finally just call context.savechanges. That will then do the work of updating records in your database.